Welcome to Sleep from History. Tonight, we're going to drift back to the muddy lanes, flickering hearths, and quiet fields of medieval Europe. Imagine yourself on a narrow dirt track, lined with hedgerows, the scent of damp earth, heavy in the evening air. In the distance, smoke curls from the thatched roofs of peasant cottages, and the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer fades into birdsong. This is a world without engines, without electricity, just candlelight wind and the rhythm of the seasons. Life here was slow, but never easy. Every bite of food was earned through aching backs, blistered hands, and relentless toil. People rose with the sun, slept with the darkness, and lived at the mercy of lords, weather, and faith. Here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't last a week. Before we start, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these sleepy journeys into history. And drop your location and local time in the comments. We're building a gentle map of listeners across the world. Now, let's drift together into the diet of a medieval peasant, earthy, humble, and surprisingly rich in history. Picture yourself in a small English village around the year 1300. The dawn mist clings to the fields, and a rooster crows somewhere in the distance. You are a serf, bound to the land, your fate tethered to the will of your lord. In exchange for a plot of land to grow food for your family, you must work his fields, repair his fences, and follow his rules. The feudal system was more than just an economic arrangement. It was a web of loyalty and obligation reinforced by oaths sworn on the Bible. The Lord offered protection, and in return, you owed him labor, sometimes days each week, spent tending crops that you would never eat. The rhythm of your life wasn't set by your own needs, but by the harvest schedule, planting seasons, and the demands of those above you. Imagine trudging through muddy furrows with a heavy wooden plow, your hands numb from the cold, knowing that a portion of every seed you plant will never feed your family. Instead, it will fill the storehouses of your Lord or the tithe barns of the church. Survival wasn't about choice. It was about obedience. The village church bell marks the passing hours, summoning villagers not only to prayer but also to duty. The church's authority was absolute. Its teachings promised eternal salvation, but demanded unquestioned service. People feared hellfire more than hunger, and so faith and farming were intertwined. For every peasant family, life was a cycle of hard work, devotion, and dependence, all beneath the looming shadow of the manor house on the hill. The church bell tolls again, this time not for prayer, but as a quiet reminder of obligation. Every family in the village owes 1/10 of their income or produce to the church, a payment known as the tithe. For peasants who rarely saw coins and bartered their lives away in labor, this meant sacks of grain, bundles of hay, or baskets of vegetables being carried to the great tithe barn at the edge of the manor. Picture the scene. Towering wooden doors swing open to reveal a cavernous hall smelling of dust and straw. Rats scurry across beams, high overhead, waiting for the bounty of spilled grain. Families drag their offerings in by handcart or on their shoulders. Every seed they leave behind represents next year's hunger. Those precious grains might have been planted in their own fields, yet here they are surrendered to God's house. Once stored, much of this food never made its way back to the poor. Rats and damp spoiled the supplies. Imagine the heartbreak of knowing the grain you sweated to grow would feed vermin instead of your children. But questioning the church was unthinkable. People were taught that disobedience could condemn their souls. Fear and faith intertwined, keeping peasants obedient even when their stomachs growled. The tithe wasn't the only burden. Beyond the Lord's fields and the church's demands, peasants also owed labor services. This meant working several days a week on land that wasn't theirs, plowing, harvesting, digging drainage ditches, or repairing fences and roads. And when all that work was done, they still had to tend their own small plot to feed their families. There was no escaping this cycle. Most peasants were bound to the soil, meaning they couldn't leave their village without permission. Birth, marriage, and even death were controlled by the Lord's will. Life revolved around obligation to the land, to the church, and to those who ruled from the safety of stone halls while peasants toiled beneath them. Yet within this hard structure of feudalism, there was a strange stability. People lived in small, tightly knit communities. Everyone knew their place. Neighbors shared tools, exchanged favors, and worked together at harvest time. The rhythm of the seasons dictated life: spring sowing, summer tending, autumn harvest, winter hunger. It was a life of repetition where time passed, not by clocks, but by the ringing of bells and the changing color of fields. Close your eyes and imagine walking home after a long day's labor. The sun sets behind a patchwork of meadows and hedgerows, and smoke rises from cottage chimneys. The air smells of wood smoke, manure, and freshly turned earth. Your back aches from bending over crops, your hands are rough from pulling weeds, but the familiar scene of the village square, a well, a chapel, a few thatched houses, brings a small comfort. This is home, simple and unchanging. Though we often imagine peasants as powerless victims of history, their resilience shaped medieval society. Despite crushing taxes and endless labor, they maintained families, built communities, and preserved traditions passed down through generations. Every loaf of bread, every sack of barley, every jug of ale drunk in a noble's hall began in the fields of these uncelebrated workers. In a world without machines, without refrigeration, and with almost no medical care, survival itself was an act of quiet heroism. The weight of the tithe was heavy, but even heavier was the understanding that tomorrow, and every tomorrow after that, the same work would begin again. Imagine stepping into a medieval peasant's home. The doorway is low, forcing you to duck your head. The smell of wood smoke, damp straw, and animals hits you instantly. A single smoky fire burns in the center of the room, its faint orange glow struggling to illuminate the space. There is no chimney, only a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape, though much of it lingers in the rafters, leaving the air thick and hazy. The walls are built from wattle and daub, woven wooden strips plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and dung. They are not smooth, but rough with cracks that let in cold drafts in winter and buzzing flies in summer. The roof is thatched thick with reeds and alive with tiny creatures that nest there. Inside, a dirt floor is covered with rushes or straw, replaced occasionally when they become too filthy, though too filthy is a relative term in this era. Beneath your feet, fleas and mites scurry unseen. Space is scarce. Most families lived in one-room cottages, often sharing the space with their livestock. At night, the family's precious cow, a few sheep or chickens, would be herded inside to keep them safe from wolves, foxes, or thieves. This was a practical choice. Losing an animal could mean starvation, but the closeness created a stifling environment. The air reeked of manure, the animals brought fleas, and the cottage floor was constantly soiled. There were no proper beds. Families slept on simple mattresses, stuffed with straw, covered be it by coarse woolen blankets. The straw quickly became infested with lice, leading to constant itching. Children often shared a bed with siblings, while parents might sleep on a wooden platform slightly raised from the floor. Warmth came not from a fireplace, but from each other huddled together against the chill of winter. Light was precious. At night, homes were dimly lit by rushlights, thin reeds dipped in animal fat, or small oil lamps. The flickering glow cast long dancing shadows on the uneven walls. Candles were rare and expensive, usually reserved for churches or wealthy households. For peasants, the end of daylight marked the slowing of life, supper eaten early, chores finished quickly, and evenings spent near the hearth. Water, when needed, had to be carried from a nearby well stream or river. Imagine trudging through mud with heavy wooden buckets, often in freezing weather. The same water source was used for cooking, washing clothes, and sometimes even disposing of waste, leading to frequent illness. There were no toilets, just buckets or pits outside. In towns, waste might be thrown into the street where pigs and stray dogs scavenged through it, adding to the stench. Despite the hardships, these cottages were homes filled with warmth of another kind family. Children played near the fire, mothers stirred pots of simmering stew, and fathers repaired tools after a day in the fields. Though peasants were poor, their homes were alive with laughter songs and the soft hum of life continuing in spite of struggle. The home was also a place of resilience. Every item was repurposed. Old cloth was patched and repatched. Broken tools were mended rather than replaced. Even food scraps were fed to animals or composted into fertilizer. Waste was a luxury no one could afford. In this way, peasant life, though rough, was deeply sustainable, with nothing going unused. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel the heat of the fire, hear the crackle of burning wood, smell the smoke and earthiness of straw. You can sense the closeness of family life, the comfort of being together against the cold. Life was harsh, but home, however humble, offered a sanctuary, a small refuge where weary peasants could rest and prepare for another day's labor beneath the ever-watchful eyes of their Lord and Church. Step outside the smoky cottage at dawn, and you'd see the lifeblood of a medieval peasant's survival livestock. Cows, pigs, chickens, and sheep were not just animals. They were walking investments, each one holding the promise of warmth, nourishment, and survival through harsh winters. For peasants, animals were wealth small, noisy, and utterly essential. A single cow could transform a family's fortunes. It was more valuable alive than dead, producing milk for butter and cheese manure, for fertilizing crops, and even warmth when brought into the home on bitter nights. But there came a time, usually after years of service, when that same cow would be slaughtered, its meat salted or smoked for the months ahead. Nothing was wasted. Bones were carved into sewing needles, buttons, or even weapon parts. Hides became leather shoes and belts. Pigs, however, were the true heroes of peasant households. They roamed freely, foraging in woods, fields, and even city streets. Their resourcefulness made them easy to raise, and when slaughtered, every part was used. Imagine a family gathered around a wooden table as sausage casings are stuffed, blood is mixed into black pudding, and strips of pork belly are salted into become bacon. Even the trotters, the pig's feet, were boiled into jelly. In a world without waste, the pig was a symbol of resourcefulness and survival. Chickens were treasured, but rarely for their meat. Eggs were too valuable, and killing a laying hen was a luxury few could afford. The morning cluck of hens scratching near the cottage was as common as the ringing of the church bell. A rooster's crow marked the rhythm of life-waking families to their endless work. Sheep provided more than just wool for clothing and blankets. Their milk was turned into hard, salty cheeses that kept through winter. When a sheep grew too old, its meat became mutton, a rare but welcome addition to a peasant's table. The sight of sheep grazing on rolling hills became so iconic that it defined medieval landscapes, just as important to survival as fields of wheat or barley. Preserving this bounty was an art. Without refrigeration, peasants relied on salt smoke and pickling. In autumn, when the air turned crisp, families would gather for butchering season. Fires were built, hooks hung above the hearth, and slabs of pork or beef smoked slowly over days. Salt was precious and costly, often imported, but worth every grain. Cured meat could mean the difference between life and death when snow buried the fields. Inside a peasant cottage, the rafters often doubled as a pantry. Strips of smoked meat hung above the fire, absorbing the scent of wood smoke, while clay pots held fat used for cooking. These simple preservation methods, though humble, sustained families through harsh winters when fields lay bare and hunting was forbidden. Meat wasn't eaten daily. It was a rare treat. More often small scraps flavored pottage or soups stretching their use. Still, those few bites carried the taste of hard-earned survival. Families celebrated these meals, not for extravagance, but for what they symbolized another season endured. In this world, livestock wasn't separate from life. It was woven into every aspect of it. Animals slept under the same roof as families, provided food, clothing, and tools, and were honored in their way. Even in poverty, medieval peasants understood the delicate balance between sustenance and sacrifice, a lesson written in every salted ham, every carefully smoked joint of beef, and every soft cluck of a hen outside the cottage door. Now picture yourself in a medieval forest, early morning mist clinging to the trees. The woods are alive with birdsong, but you move cautiously, heart pounding, not because of wild animals, but because of laws. In this era, forests were not free. They belonged to lords, barons, or even kings, and every deer, boar, or hare was theirs by law. To kill a stone without permission was an act of treason. Poachers, if caught, could face brutal punishment, whippings, mutilation, or even execution. This meant that meat was a rare luxury for peasants. Your family might dream of venison or roasted boar, but those flavors belonged to noble banquets. The forest around you, rich with game, was off limits. Hunger was a constant companion. Yet stepping into those woods with a bow or snare was an act of desperation and defiance. And still people found ways to survive. Small game like rabbits and hares offered hope. Unlike the mighty deer, they were less regulated and easier to catch. Families set simple snares along forest paths, checking them at dawn. Domesticated rabbits were also bred in warrens, large fenced pens introduced by the Normans after 1066. A rabbit stew simmering over a hearth fire was a rare feast, but one within reach. Foraging became a vital skill. Forests and hedgerows offered berries, nuts, mushrooms, and edible greens. Children were often sent out to gather wild strawberries or hazelnuts, filling baskets that would bring color and variety to otherwise monotonous meals. Every season brought its own treasure: chestnuts roasted over embers in winter, spring greens in April, blackberries staining fingers purple in late summer. Fishing provided another lifeline. If you lived near a river catching freshwater fish, trout, eels, or perch might sustain your family, but even this was often regulated. Lords controlled rights to waterways as strictly as they did forests. Some villages had communal fish ponds, carefully maintained and guarded, where families could harvest fish during lean times. Along the coasts, life was freer. Fishing villages thrived, sending salted cod and herring inland, where these became staples of the medieval diet. Salted fish was a savior, particularly during the long fasting seasons enforced by the church. Even inland families relied on barrels of preserved herring or stockfish, dried so stiff it had to be beaten with a mallet before cooking. The flavor was strong, but it was food, and in an age of scarcity, that was enough. Despite these hardships, peasants showed remarkable ingenuity. Families bartered surplus eggs, milk, or wool for meat when possible. Seasonal slaughtering, especially in autumn, was a communal event. Neighbors helped each other butcher animals, preserving every scrap for the cold months ahead. Smokehouses filled villages with the rich scent of curing meat, a reminder of preparation and shared labor. Hunting bans created deep resentment, but they also shaped a culture of quiet defiance. Folktales emerged about clever poachers outwitting greedy lords. Robin Hood, though mythologized, reflected a genuine truth. Peasants dreamed of justice, of taking back what the forest provided. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were a way to cope with hunger and unfair laws. Close your eyes and imagine life in a small hamlet. Dinner tonight might be a thin vegetable stew, flavored with a few scraps of salted pork from last year's butchering. Tomorrow maybe your father will risk setting a snare hoping for a rabbit, and if he's lucky the family will feast. But for every meal there's uncertainty, a reminder that survival wasn't guaranteed, and every mouthful of food carried a story of risk, labor, and sacrifice. The scarcity of meat shaped medieval peasant diets, but it also forged resilience. Families learned to stretch ingredients, flavor simple meals with herbs, and savor every rare taste of roasted meat or fresh fish. In these humble kitchens, ingenuity became a form of quiet resistance, proof that even in poverty, people found ways to thrive. The first chill of autumn marked more than just the change of seasons. It signaled butchering time. For medieval peasants, this was not simply a chore, but a carefully planned ritual, essential for surviving the long, harsh winter ahead. As fields were harvested and barns filled with grain, families turned their attention to livestock. Only the strongest animals would be kept alive through winter, for feeding them during months of barren pastures required resources many families didn't have. The weaker, older, or less productive animals were slaughtered, ensuring their sacrifice would sustain the household when the snow came. Picture a village in late October. The days grow shorter, mist lingers on the fields, and smoke curls from every cottage chimney. Neighbors gather in a yard where a large wooden table has been scrubbed clean. Chickens are tethered nearby. Pigs snuffle in pens, and barrels of salt stand ready. There is a sense of urgency. Once the killing begins, the work must be swift. Meat spoils quickly, and every piece must be prepared, salted, or smoked before it turns. The scene is both grim and communal. Men and women work side by side, knives flashing, hands steady. Fat is rendered into lard, poured into earthenware jars to be used for cooking throughout the winter. Sausages are carefully stuffed, tied, and hung in rows, filling the air with the scent of pepper, garlic, and smoke. Even the smallest scraps are collected. Nothing is wasted. A peasant family couldn't afford indulgence, but they understood efficiency better than anyone. Smoking meat was both art and science. In cottages, a simple hook hung over the hearth, where slabs of pork or beef were suspended, absorbing weeks of steady smoke. The fire was kept burning low and steady, filling the room with a rich, savory scent that seeped into everything: the walls, the rushes on the floor, even the family's clothes. Over time, the smoked meat hardened, darkened, and became shelf-stable, lasting months. Without refrigeration, salting was equally essential. Large cuts of meat were rubbed thoroughly with coarse salt, layered in barrels, and left to cure. Salt was expensive, often imported from distant salt works, but its importance couldn't be overstated. For peasants, salt was life. Its presence on the table was a mark of wealth. Its absence could mean famine. Families might barter eggs, wool, or labor to obtain enough to preserve their winter supply. As autumn faded into winter, these preparations became the foundation of survival. Picture a cottage in January outside snow blankets. The fields inside, strips of bacon hang in the rafters. Barrels of salted meat line the wall, and pots of rendered fat sit near the fire. Meals were small, but sustaining thin broth, flavored with smoked pork bread, dipped into stew, and the occasional precious piece of meat shared among the family. The hunger of winter was constant, but starvation could be kept at bay through this careful practiced cycle of butchering and preservation. The preservation of meat shaped not only diets, but also community bonds. Villages often shared resources and expertise. A neighbor might have a large smokehouse, another access to more salt, another skill in sausage making. By pooling their knowledge, peasants turned necessity into tradition. These gatherings weren't merely practical, they were social events with songs, laughter, and stories exchanged as hands worked tirelessly. This communal spirit extended beyond food. The same neighbors who helped you hang hams in your rafters might also help repair your roof, lend a tool, or share seed for next year's crops. Winter, with its biting winds and barren fields, was not just endured, but outwitted, and the smoke curling from chimneys became a symbol of this quiet triumph. In this rhythm of slaughter, preservation, and shared labor, medieval peasants displayed a resilience often overlooked in modern retellings of their lives. They weren't simply victims of poverty, they were masters of adaptation, deeply connected to the land and the cycles of nature. Every slice of bacon, every hardened joint of beef, every carefully salted ham told a story not of luxury, but of ingenuity, community, and survival. Step into a medieval village at dusk, the sky awash with fading gold. Thatched roofs huddle together like tired sentinels, smoke drifting lazily from small holes cut into rooftops. You duck into a cottage stooping low to enter. The doorway is so narrow, your shoulders brush the frame. Instantly, the scent of wood smoke, manure, and damp straw envelopes you. This is home for a medieval peasant family. The house is built from wattle and daub, a simple weave of wooden sticks, plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and manure. The structure is sturdy, but humble, offering little insulation against winter cold. A single central fire provides warmth and light, but there's no chimney. The smoke curls upward and lingers beneath the low rafter, staining everything black. Villagers' eyes are often red and watery from breathing smoke day after day. The floor is bare earth, covered in rushes or straw, replaced only when the stench becomes unbearable. Over time, Layers of dirt, food scraps, and animal waste build up beneath the floor covering, attracting vermin. Rats and mice scurry freely. Fleas nest in the straw, bringing with them constant itching and occasional outbreaks of disease. There are no separate rooms, just one shared space where the family sleeps, cooks and eats. Parents and children huddle on straw-stuffed mattresses, blankets made from coarse wool, providing meager warmth. Babies sleep beside mothers for safety, while older children share bedding for warmth. If the family owns livestock, animals sleep inside as well. A single cow, a few chickens, or a goat might be tethered near the door. Their breath adds warmth to the room, but their presence also means fleas, manure, and an overpowering odor. Furniture is minimal. A rough wooden table, a bench or two, perhaps a simple chest to store clothes or grain. Tools hang from the walls. Pots and pans, few in number, are treasured possessions. Even spoons are often hand-carved from wood, while knives double as both eating utensils and farming tools. At night, light comes from rushlights, reeds dipped in animal fat that burn with a faint flicker, or small clay lamps fueled by tallow. Candles, expensive and labor-intensive to make, are a rarity for peasants. Evenings are spent close to the fire, telling stories or repairing clothes by dim light. Time feels slow, marked by the crackle of the fire and the distant toll of the church bell. The air inside is thick and heavy, filled with smoke, and the scent of drying herbs hung from rafters. These herbs, like rosemary or lavender, are not just for cooking. They're thought to ward off evil spirits and mask the stench of life in such close quarters. The smoke preserves meat hung over the hearth, its scent seeping into every surface of the cottage. Privacy is almost non-existent. Large families share this single room, with everyone living in close quarters, from birth to death. Guests are rare, but when they come, hospitality is offered generously, even if it means squeezing tighter together. For all its harshness, this small cottage is a fortress against the cold and dark of medieval nights. Wolves still roam the countryside, and foxes prowl the edges of villages. Keeping livestock indoors is a necessity, and the sturdy door offers protection from thieves or rival villagers. The peasant cottage is more than a shelter. It's a survival tool, a place where everything food warmth. Family gathers under one roof. As you step back into the crisp evening, you realize that these humble homes, built with sweat and simple materials, were the backbone of medieval Europe. Every thatched roof is a testament to resilience, a small beacon of life in a world defined by struggle and scarcity. Step outside that smoky cottage and follow a narrow dirt path to the village well. The air is damp, the smell of livestock and wood smoke mingling with something less pleasant waste. In medieval villages, sanitation as we know it simply didn't exist. Buckets of human waste were emptied into open ditches or simply tossed onto the street. Pigs and stray dogs rooted through refuse, spreading the stench and filth. Rain turned these dirt paths into muddy rivers, carrying everything downhill. Water was precious, but never guaranteed safe. Most peasants relied on well streams or nearby rivers for drinking, washing, and cooking. Picture trudging barefoot through morning frost with 2 heavy wooden buckets, walking half a mile to draw water from a well. Even then, that water could be contaminated. Upstream, another family might have dumped waste or livestock, might have waded into the stream. Many villagers boiled water when possible, but fuel was limited, so this wasn't always practical. In towns and cities, conditions were far worse. Streets were narrow and crowded, and waste from chamber pots often landed directly outside doorsteps. Public latrines existed, but were rudimentary wooden benches over deep pits, often shared by dozens. Streams cutting through towns carried sewage alongside water for laundry or cooking. The smell of a medieval city was unforgettable. Human waste animal manure, unwashed bodies, and rotting food combined into a constant choking odor. Inside peasant cottages, a garderobe was a luxury. Most households used a bucket or a simple wooden stool with a hole in it, emptying it outside each morning. Night soil human waste was sometimes collected and used as fertilizer, but this came with risks. The understanding of disease was limited. People didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that bad smells or miasmas could make you sick. They burned sweet-smelling herbs to ward off illness, believing that pleasant scents purified the air. Bathing was rare, partly due to limited resources and partly because of cultural beliefs. Many feared that hot baths opened the pores and made people vulnerable to disease. Instead, people wiped themselves with cloths, washed hands and faces, and occasionally bathed in rivers or tubs if water was plentiful. In wealthier towns, bathhouses existed, but peasants often couldn't afford the time or money to use them. For most villagers, a full bath was a seasonal ritual rather than a daily routine. Clothing absorbed the grime of daily life. Wool tunics, linen undergarments, and cloaks rarely saw soap, and lye soap itself was harsh, made from animal fat and ashes. Lice and fleas were constant companions, so much so that medieval people often joked about their presence. Bedding was shaken out to remove insects, but infestations were inevitable. Despite these grim realities, medieval people developed ways to cope. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, and sage were tucked into bedding or hung from rafters to mask odors. Floors were strewn with fresh rushes mixed with aromatic plants like mint and chamomile, both for fragrance and to absorb moisture. Villagers had a keen sense of smell and a practical understanding of how to avoid illness, even if their science was primitive. If you close your eyes, you can imagine me in a bustling medieval street. A horse-drawn cart rattles by chickens, dart between your legs. A fishmonger calls out prices, and the air is thick with a mix of roasting meat and raw sewage. There is no escaping the smells. They are part of daily life, a backdrop as constant as the church bells tolling in the distance. Yet within this roughness was resilience. Medieval communities worked together to keep wells clean, maintained drainage ditches, and shared knowledge about herbs and remedies. Even in the filthiest alleys of a medieval town, people found ways to survive, laugh, and thrive. Dirt, stink, and disease weren't anomalies. They were the texture of life. And for peasants, enduring that reality was simply part of being alive in a world built on hard labor and simple hope. The medieval peasant's home wasn't just a shelter. It was a living, breathing space that required constant care. Imagine a day that begins at dawn with a rooster's cry echoing through the misty fields. A mother stirs the embers in the hearth, coaxing flames to life while her children fetch water from the well. The scent of smoke, fresh straw, and damp earth fills the air as another day begins. Every morning brought a cycle of maintenance that was as important as farming. Rushes or straw on the floor were shaken out, though they were rarely replaced entirely. Most homes refreshed them only a few times a year, often during festivals. Fresh herbs were scattered underfoot to combat smells their sweet, sharp scent, a small comfort amid the constant dirt. The hearth needed cleaning, ashes scraped into a pile to be later mixed with water for making lye soap. In every corner of the home, evidence of yesterday's labor lingered: muddy boots, drying herbs, cooking pots blackened by smoke. Women often shouldered the burden of keeping the home functional. After cooking the morning meal, they spun wool-repaired clothes or wove cloth on simple looms. Clothes were patched until they nearly fell apart, and every scrap of fabric was repurposed. A shirt might be mended a dozen times before being cut into rags, and even those rags would eventually be used as kindling. Medieval peasants lived with a resourcefulness that modern life rarely requires. Nothing was wasted. Children had their own roles in maintaining the household. They swept floors, gathered firewood, and helped care for animals. A young boy might be sent out with a sling to guard crops from birds, while his sister gathered eggs or fetched herbs for cooking. Even leisure moments were filled with small tasks: mothers shelling peas by the fire, fathers repairing tools after supper, older siblings mending shoes by candlelight. The home was not a place of rest alone. It was a constant workshop buzzing with quiet industry. Seasonal changes brought new chores. In autumn, cottages were fortified against winter winds. Cracks in the wattle and daub walls were patched with fresh mud, and extra straw was stacked high near the door. Winter meant huddling inside smoke, curling up through a hole in the roof, while meat smoked slowly above the hearth. In spring, roofs were inspected and thatch repaired. Maintenance wasn't optional, it was survival. A hole in the roof could ruin precious grain stores. A poorly sealed wall could mean a draft that led to sickness. Evenings in the home were dim and smoky, but rich with human connection. Families gathered near the hearth, sharing stories and songs. Children dozed off to the rhythm of spinning wheels, or the hiss of fat dripping into the fire. The only sounds outside were the hoot of an owl, the distant bark of a dog, or the howl of a wolf across the fields. Inside, the small circle of firelight created a cocoon of warmth, a refuge from the dangers lurking in the dark. For all its harshness, this daily rhythm created a sense of security. The peasant cottage was humble but dependable, built from local materials and maintained by familiar hands. In a time when famine, disease, and war could sweep through villages, the home was a sanctuary. It may have been filled with fleas, smoke, and clutter, but it was also filled with laughter, family, and life. Close your eyes and picture yourself curling up on a straw mattress near the hearth, a woolen blanket pulled tight. The air is smoky, but the fire is warm, and the soft clucking of a hen nearby reminds you that tomorrow life will continue as it always has. For the medieval peasant, this rhythm of home life was both grounding and eternal, a heartbeat that tied generations together. Picture yourself standing at a wooden wash basin near the hearth, holding a clay jug of cold water. The liquid feels like ice against your fingers. There is no soap as we know it today. Instead, peasants used lye soap, a harsh, gritty mixture of ashes and animal fat that stung the skin. Washing was rarely a daily activity. Most peasants bathed only a few times a year, often during special occasions or religious festivals. Despite the lack of modern hygiene, medieval people weren't oblivious to cleanliness. They washed their hands before meals, rinsed their faces in the mornings, and cleaned their feet after working in the fields. Water was fetched from streams or wells and heated over the fire for bathing. Though full-body baths were rare due to fuel costs and the difficulty of carrying water, instead, peasants relied on sponge baths, wiping themselves down with wet cloths. Hair care was simple. Women often covered their hair with linen veils or wimples to keep dust away, while men kept their hair trimmed with knives or shears. Lice were a constant nuisance, so families used wooden combs, often soaking them in vinegar or oil to kill pests. These combs were treasured tools passed down through generations. Teeth were cleaned, not with toothbrushes, but with twigs and cloth. People rubbed ashes or crushed herbs on their teeth to freshen their breath. Mint, rosemary, and sage were common choices not only for flavor, but because they were believed to ward off illness. In villages, bad breath was considered a sign of poor health, so herbal remedies doubled as primitive dental care. Illness was a constant shadow. Without understanding germs, villagers blamed bad air curses or spiritual punishment. The smell of rotting waste and smoke-filled cottages created an atmosphere ripe for disease, yet medieval communities developed creative coping strategies. Herbs like lavender, garlic, and rue were used as natural repellents, and smoke itself was thought to purify air. Peasants endured frequent ailments, aches from manual labor, respiratory issues from smoky rooms, and skin problems from infrequent bathing. Still, survival instincts were strong. Village healers, often wise women or monks, used poultices, honey, and vinegar washes to treat wounds. Honey, in particular, was prized for its antibacterial properties long before science confirmed it. Bathhouses existed in towns offering heated water and communal tubs, but peasants rarely visited. For many, the risk of disease from shared water outweighed the benefits, especially during outbreaks of plague or fever. Instead, the countryside's answer to hygiene was simplicity, fresh air, clean linen, and herbs scattered through rushes on the cottage floor. Imagine yourself sitting by the hearth after a long day peeling off mud-stained boots. Your hands are rough and blistered, but they are cleaned with a damp cloth. The smell of rosemary wafts from bundles hanging above the fire. In this world, cleanliness wasn't about luxury, but about survival and faith. People believed purity of body was connected to purity of soul, so even small acts of washing carried spiritual meaning. Though medieval life was far from sanitary, by today's standards, peasants were remarkably resourceful. They learned to live with lice, fleas, and dirt while finding ways to manage them. This daily battle with nature was part of life, shaping a culture of resilience and endurance. Hygiene may have been primitive, but it reflected a deep connection between people, their homes, and the land they worked. Step outside your cottage and look around. The village is small, but alive with movement. Chickens scratch near doorways, geese hiss from behind wicker fences, and children run barefoot through puddles. Beyond the cottages lies a patchwork of fields, meadows, and hedgerows, a carefully organized ecosystem designed for survival. At the heart of the village stands a manor house or hall, the seat of the local lord. Its size and sturdier construction make it stand out among the simple cottages. Close by is the church, its bell tower visible for miles, calling villagers to prayer and serving as a gathering point. Surrounding the church is often a small graveyard, headstones tilted from centuries of weather. The village green is a bustling hub. Here, livestock grazes, travelers pass through, and markets are held. On feast days, villagers gather for dancing, storytelling, and games. The sound of laughter mixes with the bleating of sheep and the creak of wooden carts. Even in arid times, these communal spaces provide relief, a reminder that life is shared, not just endured. Roads are muddy tracks carved by cartwheels and boots, and in wet weather, they become rivers of muck. Stone bridges, when they exist, are rare and precious, linking villages and trade routes. Alongside roads, ditches help drain water, but they often overflow, filling the air with a sour smell. Yet this rough landscape is home. Every hedge, every eth is familiar. Community wells and wash areas are social spaces. Women gather here to exchange news while scrubbing clothes on flat stones. Children splash nearby, their laughter brightening the morning chores. These communal spots are lifelines, offering water and connection in equal measure. Nearby fields follow a strict rhythm. The three-field system divides land into strips, one for winter crops, one for spring crops, and one left fallow. This rotation prevents soil exhaustion and ensures some harvest even in bad years. Villagers share tools and oxen, working together to plow and sow. In this world, survival is collective. One family's failure could ripple through the entire community. Forests at the village edge provide timber, firewood, and wild herbs. Children forage for berries while men collect kindling, careful not to break forest laws that restrict hunting. These woods, both feared and revered, are places of mystery, home to wolves, bandits, and folklore. Fireside tales of spirits and fairies aren't just entertainment, they're warnings, woven into the fabric of rural life. The rhythm of the village changes with the seasons. Spring brings lambing and plowing, summer brings haymaking, autumn the harvest, and winter a slower pace with long nights by the hearth. The landscape itself reflects this cycle, fields green and lush in summer, barren and brown under frost, alive again as birds return in spring. For medieval peasants, their homes weren't isolated huts, but part of a living network. The village was an extension of family, a shared space of labor, celebration, and faith. Neighbors helped rebuild damaged roofs, shared seeds in lean years, and came together for weddings, baptisms, and funerals. Though harsh, this life was deeply rooted in community, where every face was known and every hand contributed to survival. Close your eyes and imagine standing in the middle of this village. The air smells of smoke and damp hay. Distant church bells toll softly, and geese waddle across your path. It's humble, muddy, and loud, but it's alive, a vibrant heart beating in the center of medieval Europe. Step into a medieval field at sunrise. The golden heads of barley and wheat sway gently in the morning breeze, dew glistening on each stalk. For peasants, these fields weren't just scenery, they were survival itself. Grains formed the backbone of every meal, dictating diets, trade, and even social status. Without a successful harvest, famine loomed close. Crops like barley, oats, and rye dominated the medieval countryside. Wheat, prized for its softness and lighter color, was rarer and more expensive, often reserved for wealthier households. Most peasants ate dark bread made from rye or barley, coarse and filling. Oats thrived in wetter, cooler climates like Scotland and northern England, where wheat refused to grow. Villagers adapted to what their land could provide, shaping regional cuisines for centuries. Grain cultivation was labor-intensive, a year-round cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. In spring, villagers scattered seeds by hand, their movements rhythmic and practiced. In summer, They weeded fields under the hot sun. Come autumn, the air filled with the sound of sickles slicing stalks and the scent of freshly cut straw. Every able-bodied family member joined in, even children. Harvest was a community effort. Neighbors worked side by side, knowing that one family's failure could harm the entire village. After cutting, grain was bound into sheaves and stacked in stooks to dry, forming small golden towers dotting the fields. Threshing came next, separating grain from stalk with flails, a back-breaking job done in barns through the cold months. Picture the scene: peasants in wool tunics swing flails rhythmically, dust swirling around them as grain rains onto the floor. The barn smells of hay, sweat, and earth, lit only by shafts of sunlight streaming through cracks in the walls. Storage was a constant battle against pests. Grain bins and sacks were guarded fiercely, but rats and mice often found their way in. Villagers built raised granaries to keep rodents out and mixed herbs like mint and lavender with grain to deter insects. Despite these efforts, loss was inevitable. The fear of famine haunted every harvest. One bad season could lead to hunger, disease, and death. Grain wasn't just food, it was currency. Rents, taxes, and church tithes were often paid in sacks of barley or wheat rather than coins. The church's tithe barns loomed large in every village, their walls stacked high with offerings that represented months of labor. Lords took their share as well, leaving peasants with just enough to feed their families through the winter. Flour milling was a critical step, usually done at the Lord's mill. Water wheels turned with steady creaks, powering massive stones that ground grain into flour. The air inside was thick, with white dust coating everything, even the miller's eyebrows. Peasants were required to pay for milling, often surrendering a portion of their grain. The sound of the mill's turning wheel became part of the village's daily music, symbolizing both nourishment and obligation. The diet of peasants was grain-heavy, not out of choice, but necessity. Bread, porridge, and gruel were staples, filling bellies, even when meat and vegetables were scarce. Grain provided the calories needed for back-breaking labor, though it offered little variety. Yet despite the monotony, medieval people developed an intimate relationship with these humble crops. They knew the land intimately, reading signs in the soil and weather, trusting ancestral knowledge passed down through generations. Close your eyes and imagine kneeling in a medieval field, dirt under your nails, the smell of freshly turned soil filling the air. The hum of bees drifts past, mingling with the distant toll of the church bell. Every stalk of barley represents not just food, but survival, security, and hope for the months ahead. In this world, grain wasn't just sustenance, it was life itself, a golden thread weaving together the story of medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food, it was a marker of wealth, faith, and survival. The loaf on your table revealed more about your life than your clothes or home ever could. Its color, texture, and ingredients told a story of class, climate, and community. For peasants, bread was dark, heavy, and coarse. Baked from rye, barley, or oats, it was often flecked with husks and seeds, sometimes even pebbles from poorly milled flour. Chewing it required effort. Its density filled bellies, but offered little refinement. This was the black bread of the poor, a far cry from the soft white loaves reserved for nobility. Wheat flour, expensive and difficult to grow in many regions, was ground into fine white flour used to make wastel bread, a luxury delicacy so prized it was served at feasts and religious ceremonies. Bread wasn't just nourishment, it was deeply symbolic. In a deeply Christian society, bread represented the body of Christ in the Eucharist. Monasteries, cathedrals, and parish churches baked special loaves for holy days. The blessing of bread before meals was a spiritual ritual, a reminder of gratitude and divine providence. For peasants, bread was daily life. Families baked weekly or even bi-weekly, often relying on communal ovens in the village. Picture a line of women carrying baskets of dough wrapped in cloth, waiting their turn at the shared oven. Its stone walls radiating heat. The smell of freshly baked loaves would waft through the village, mingling with the earthy scent of livestock and hay. Baking day was more than a chore. It was a social event, a time for conversation and gossip, as neighbors shared news over baskets of rising dough. But bread wasn't always pure. In years of bad harvest, families stretched flour with whatever was available: peas, beans, chestnut flour, even ground acorns. This horse bread was edible but rough, a stark reminder of scarcity. Some bakers even cheated, adding chalk or ground bone to flour to increase weight, a practice punished harshly when discovered. Bread also doubled as a utensil. In noble households, thick slices of stale bread, called trenchers, served as plates soaking up gravy and sauces. Once softened, they were eaten or given to servants and beggars. For peasants, bread was the meal itself, accompanied by cheese, onions, or ale. It was often the only sustenance during long days of work in the fields. Regional variations in bread reflected geography. In Italy and southern France, where wheat grew more easily, lighter loaves were more common. In northern Europe, rye dominated, giving bread a sour tang. Flatbreads and pancakes appeared in Scandinavia, while in parts of Ireland, oats were shaped into thin bannocks and baked on griddles. Though humble bread connected medieval Europe through shared necessity, a universal staple across languages and cultures, the importance of bread was so profound that medieval law protected its quality. In England, the assize of bread and ale, 1266, regulated the weight and price of loaves. Bakers caught cheating customers faced heavy fines or public humiliation, sometimes even having loaves tied around their necks in shame. This regulation reflects bread's centrality to life. Tampering with it was a direct assault on survival. Close your eyes and imagine the warmth of a medieval bakehouse. The fire roars in a stone oven, illuminating the flour-dusted faces of bakers as they slide in round loaves on wooden paddles. The smell is heavenly comforting in a world of hardship. For peasants, this bread might be dense and dark, but it was life itself, a simple sustaining miracle born of soil sweat and centuries of tradition. In medieval Europe, bread transcended poverty and wealth, serving as the great equalizer. Whether black bread eaten by peasants or gleaming white loaves on a lord's table, every crumb was hard-won, a testament to toil and the fragile balance of nature that kept famine forever at the edge of memory. Imagine a medieval peasant's breakfast, not a feast of eggs, bacon, or fresh pastries, but a steaming wooden bowl of porridge or gruel, a simple mixture of oats, barley, or millet, boiled in water, sometimes with a splash of milk if the family had a cow. For centuries, this dish was the foundation of daily sustenance, warming bellies before a long day of labor. Porridge was as versatile as it was humble. On good days, honey or dried fruit might sweeten it. On bad days, it was plain bland and eaten only to keep hunger at bay. Gruel was even thinner, a watery broth of grains or bread scraps often served to the elderly or sick. Yet these dishes, while unglamorous, were essential in a world where calories meant survival. The evening meal often featured pottage, a heartier stew made from whatever ingredients were available: carrots, leeks, onions, cabbage, and beans, simmered slowly over the hearth. If scraps of meat or bone were available, they were added for flavor, but most pottage was vegetarian by necessity. Herbs such as thyme, parsley, or sage added fragrance and taste. The dish was never the same 2 days in a row. It evolved with the season and the family's resources. Picture a peasant woman stirring a bubbling pot in a smoky cottage. The pot hangs from a blackened iron hook, its contents thickening as barley releases starch into the broth. The smell is comforting, a savory mix of herbs, vegetables, and smoke. Children sit cross-legged nearby, clutching wooden bowls, their eyes following every movement of the ladle. This humble stew is both dinner and tomorrow's lunch, a staple that could stretch to feed an entire family. The preparation of these dishes was shaped by necessity. Fuel was precious, so meals were cooked in one pot to conserve firewood. Families placed ingredients in the pot in the morning, letting it simmer all day while they worked in the fields. By evening, the stew had absorbed the flavors of hours of slow cooking, its warmth a comfort after long hours outdoors. Leftovers were rarely discarded. Instead, more vegetables or grains were added, creating a perpetual meal that changed slightly each day. Pottage and porridge weren't just meals, they were cultural cornerstones. Recipes varied regionally, reflecting the crops that thrived in each area. In Northern Europe, oats and barley dominated, while in southern regions, millet and wheat were more common. Medieval cookbooks, though, for peasants, these meals were also a form of nutritional insurance. Even without meat, pottage provided essential vitamins from vegetables and energy from grains. Families often grew beans and peas to add protein, creating a surprisingly balanced diet despite their limited means. In times of scarcity, these dishes became thinner and plainer, but they were rarely absent altogether. Cultural attitudes toward these foods reveal much about medieval life. Nobles looked down on porridge and pottage as peasant food, associating them with poverty. Yet these dishes were incredibly efficient, feeding families cheaply and sustainably. In monasteries, monks often ate similar meals during fasting periods, reflecting a spiritual connection between humility and simple food. Close your eyes and imagine sitting on a wooden bench near the fire, cradling a warm bowl of pottage in your hands. The steam carries the scent of thyme and smoke, mingling with the crackle of burning wood. Outside, snow drifts across barren fields, but inside this modest stew offers warmth and nourishment. In a world defined by labor and scarcity, porridge and pottage weren't just meals. They were lifelines sustaining generations through famine, war, and harsh winters. Though modern diets often celebrate abundance, medieval peasants found comfort in these humble dishes. Each spoonful represented resilience, creativity, and a deep connection to the land, a reminder that survival could be achieved with even the simplest ingredients. Imagine yourself standing by a medieval riverbank at dawn. Mist rolls off the water as fishermen pull up nets heavy with glistening trout and perch. In the distance, a church bell rings, reminding everyone of the rhythms that shaped daily life, both earthly and spiritual. In medieval Europe, fish was more than food. It was a lifeline and a symbol of faith. For peasants, fresh fish was a treat, but access wasn't guaranteed. Lords controlled fishing rights, and many rivers and lakes were strictly regulated. Still, villages often had communal ponds, carefully stocked and managed to ensure food security. Families living near the coast fared better. Seaside communities became hubs of trade drying and salting fish to sell inland. For those far from water, fish was often purchased, salted, smoked, or pickled, its flavor strong but essential during fasting seasons when meat was forbidden. The Catholic Church dictated much of medieval Europe's eating habits, and fish's importance skyrocketed because of religious fasting rules. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Lent required abstaining from meat-pushing fish to the forefront of medieval diets. Monasteries, with their access to resources and skilled cooks, perfected recipes for fish dishes, elevating humble ingredients into something worthy of noble tables. Even in small villages, peasants understood how to prepare fish to stretch supplies. Salted cod and pickled herring became staples. Salt was a precious commodity, but its use in preserving fish revolutionized trade and survival. Imagine barrels of dried cod known as stockfish, stacked in market stalls, their stiff bodies clacking together like wood. This dried fish, first popularized in Scandinavia, became a cornerstone of medieval commerce, feeding armies, sailors, and villagers alike. Pickled herring was equally vital, especially in northern Europe, where it provided sustenance during long winters. The strong vinegar brine masked spoilage and kept food edible for months. Not all fish was humble fare. Certain species became delicacies for the wealthy. Lampreys, jawless, eel-like fish with a fearsome mouth of teeth, were considered a royal treat. King Henry I of England famously died after overindulging in lamprey stew. Salmon, sturgeon, and pike also graced noble banquets, often roasted whole and presented with elaborate sauces thickened with bread wine and spices. For peasants, glimpses of these extravagant dishes were rare, but stories of their preparation circulated like legends. Fishing techniques were ingenious and labor-intensive. Nets were woven by hand, often dyed with plant extracts to make them stronger. Fishermen used wicker traps and weirs to guide fish into enclosures. In some communities, fish farming was practiced. Ponds near monasteries were meticulously managed, and monks became masters of aquatic agriculture, ensuring a steady food supply that met religious fasting needs. Picture a medieval fish market. The smell is sharp salt brine, and smoke fill the air. Traders in rough woolen tunics shout prices over the noise of carts and livestock. Barrels of herring eels, coiled in baskets, and dried stockfish hang from wooden stalls. Even in inland towns, these bustling markets provided a taste of the sea, linking villages hundreds of miles apart through trade. For peasants, fish was tied to both practicality and faith. Eating it wasn't just nourishment, it was obedience to the church. Meals during Lent were simple but comforting. Salted fish boiled with herbs, perhaps served with a hunk of coarse bread. The aroma of parsley and garlic simmering in a clay pot filled smoky kitchens, offering warmth during seasons of religious austerity. Close your eyes and imagine yourself sitting at a rough wooden table, dipping bread into a steaming bowl of fish stew. The flavor is salty and earthy, carrying the essence of rivers and seas you may never see. In a world without refrigeration, fish preservation was nothing short of miraculous. a bridge between scarcity and plenty, fasting and feasting, survival and faith. Imagine the hum of a medieval market square, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the murmur of bargaining voices, and the aroma of bread, fish, and herbs mingling in the cool morning air. Here, food wasn't just sustenance, it was currency power and survival. For peasants, markets offered a rare chance to trade by and connect with the wider world beyond their small village. Grain, the cornerstone of medieval life, was often paid as rent tax or tithe rather than consumed at home. The lord's granaries and tithe barns stored immense quantities of barley, oats, and rye, leaving peasants to carefully ration what remained. Markets were essential for filling gaps. A family might trade eggs or wool for extra flour, or fish, relying on barter when coinage was scarce. Coins themselves were precious and often worn thin from decades of use. The milling of grain was tightly controlled. Most peasants were required to use the Lord's mill, paying a portion of their grain as a fee. Picture a watermill by a rushing stream. A giant wheel turns steadily, creaking as gears grind grain between heavy stones. Inside, flour dust hangs in the air, coating every surface in a fine white powder. The miller, an important figure in any village, was both respected and resented, his livelihood tied to the labor of others. Markets were colorful and noisy, filled with goods beyond local produce. Traveling merchants brought salt from coastal regions, a precious necessity for preserving meat and fish. Spices, though expensive, occasionally appeared imported along vast trade routes from Asia. A small pouch of pepper or cinnamon was worth days of labor. But even peasants might splurge on such luxuries for weddings or feast days. The market was also a social center, buzzing with gossip news of distant lands and the latest decrees from kings or lords. Imagine stalls of woven baskets overflowing with root vegetables, clay pots brimming with honey, and live chickens clucking nervously in cages. Fishmongers shout prices over the roar of the crowd, and bakers carry baskets of freshly baked bread, the smell warm and inviting. Children dart between stalls, chasing dogs, or playing near wagons, stacked high with barrels of ale. The market was chaotic, alive, and deeply human. Food economics shaped medieval society in ways that went beyond the table. Crop failure in one region could send ripples of hunger across entire kingdoms. Drought or flooding often triggered rising grain prices, plunging the poor into hardship, while merchants and landlords grew richer. During bad harvest years, peasants survived on horse-bread loaves, mixed with beans, peas, or acorns, while wealthier households could still afford fine white loaves. Hunger wasn't just physical, it was a constant reminder of inequality. Yet markets also offered hope. Peasants could sell surplus vegetables, wool, or cheese to earn a few coins, which might pay for a tool, new clothing, or even a rare treat like sugared almonds. Fairs held annually or seasonally transformed sleepy towns into bustling centers of commerce, attracting merchants from far-off lands. These events were a feast for the senses, filled with music performances and exotic goods that offered a brief escape from the harsh rhythm of rural life. The interconnectedness of food trade and community was profound. A single loaf of bread represented the labor of farmers, millers, bakers, and merchants. A salted herring might have traveled hundreds of miles before landing on a peasant's plate. This invisible web of trade tied together villages, towns, and cities in a way that few peasants understood but all depended upon. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing in that bustling square, a basket in hand, the smell of spices and bread filling the air. Every coin you spend, every item you trade is part of a system that has sustained life for centuries. In a world where hunger was always near markets, were more than just places to shop, they were lifelines, vibrant and vital, stitching medieval Europe together through food, faith, and commerce. Picture yourself sitting at a rough wooden table in a smoky medieval cottage. The smell of freshly baked rye bread mingles with herbs drying above the hearth. You've worked from dawn to dusk, your stomach growling with hunger. Yet tonight, there's no meat in the pot, no eggs to fry, and no milk for the children's porridge. Why? Because the church has declared today a fast day, and across Europe millions of families are observing the same rule. In the Middle Ages, faith wasn't a private matter. It was a powerful force that governed nearly every decision, including what and when you ate. The Catholic Church dominated daily life, from kings in their castles to peasants in their cottages. Meals were deeply tied to religious rituals, beliefs, and restrictions, turning food into a spiritual act as much as a physical necessity. The medieval calendar was studded with feast days and fast days. Fasting, as practiced then, didn't mean total abstinence from food, but rather strict restrictions. On Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, meat was banned entirely. Dairy products like butter, cheese, and eggs were often forbidden, too particularly during Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter. In some regions, fasting extended to multiple meals per day, with only one main meal allowed after sunset. For a peasant laboring in the fields, these restrictions were a test of both faith and endurance. Imagine trudging back from the fields, your back aching, hands blistered, and stomach empty, only to be greeted by a simple meal, perhaps salted fish, boiled with onions, or a thin vegetable stew served with coarse bread. Hunger became part of religious devotion. To eat sparingly was to cleanse the soul, preparing for holy celebrations. This discipline, enforced by priests and deeply ingrained in the culture, gave food a moral weight it no longer carries today. Even wealthy households observed these rules. Nobles who feasted on roasted swan or spiced venison during feast days would replace their lavish spreads with fish grains and vegetables during fasts. Monasteries followed especially strict diets, eating simple fare year-round as a form of spiritual humility. Yet, monks became culinary innovators, perfecting recipes for fish bread and ale that would later spread across Europe. The famous beers of Belgium and Germany, for example, have their roots in monastic brewing traditions. Lent was the most challenging season for peasants. For over 6 weeks, families gave up meat, dairy, and eggs entirely. Children gnawed on dry bread, while parents stirred pots of salted herring barley gruel or cabbage stew. Picture a smoky kitchen, its rafters lined with drying herbs, as a mother prepares yet another fish-based dish. The monotony was a form of sacrifice, a reminder of Christ's suffering. Even during famine, villagers would follow these restrictions, believing that breaking them might endanger their souls. Food was also deeply symbolic. Bread and wine became the body and blood of Christ in the sacrament of communion, elevating these simple staples to sacred status. This reverence carried into daily life. Peasants often made the sign of the cross over loaves before cutting them, and wasting bread was considered a sin. Meals began and ended with prayer emphasizing that every bite was a gift from God. Religion didn't just restrict diets, it united communities. Fasting days meant shared hardship, while feast days brought celebration. After a season of restraint, Easter and Christmas meals were lavish affairs even in peasant cottages. Families slaughtered animals, baked honey cakes, and brewed fresh ale, filling their homes with warmth and laughter. These moments of abundance felt even sweeter after months of austerity. Close your eyes and imagine a medieval village on Good Friday. Bells toll softly in the distance, signaling solemnity. In every cottage, the smell of fish stew drifts through the air. Families bow their heads in prayer before eating. Though the meal is plain, there's a sense of unity. Every household in the village and every village in Europe is observing the same ritual. Food in the Middle Ages wasn't merely fuel, it was a spiritual experience, a bridge between earth and heaven. Imagine a quiet monastery in the rolling hills of medieval Europe. Bells ring softly through the mist, calling monks to prayer before dawn. Inside the cloister, robed figures move silently, their sandals whispering against stone floors, polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. As the sun rises, the air fills with the scent of baking bread and simmering broth drifting from the monastery kitchen, a place of discipline, devotion, and quiet innovation. Monks followed strict rules about food, many outlined in the Rule of Saint Benedict, which shaped monastic life across Europe for centuries. Meals were simple and deliberately austere. Meat from four-legged animals was forbidden, both as an act of humility and to discourage indulgence. Fish, vegetables, legumes, bread, and ale formed the backbone of their diet. Even dairy was limited in some orders, replaced by almond milk or simple vegetable broths. Eating wasn't just about nourishment, it was an act of worship meant to quiet the body so the spirit could focus on God. Picture a monastery refectory, a long stone hall lined with wooden tables and benches. Monks sit in silence, heads bowed, while a single reader stands at a lectern, reciting scripture aloud. The only sounds are the crackle of the hearth and the scrape of wooden spoons against clay bowls. Silence during meals was a tradition meant to cultivate reflection and humility. Monastic kitchens operated like carefully managed workshops. Monks were some of the best farmers and horticulturists of their time, cultivating extensive vegetable gardens, orchards, and fish ponds. Herbs like sage, thyme, and mint grew in neat rows used both for cooking and medicine. Fish ponds stocked with carp or trout ensured a steady protein supply, especially during fasting seasons. By designing sustainable food systems, monasteries became self-sufficient havens in a world often plagued by famine and instability. Though monks lived simply, their knowledge transformed European cuisine. Monasteries preserved and copied Roman and Arabic agricultural texts, experimenting with techniques like grafting fruit trees and rotating crops. They perfected cheese-making, developing methods for aging cheese in cellars and wrapping wheels in herbs or cloth. Some of Europe's most famous cheeses, like Munster and Roquefort, trace their origins to monastic innovation. Brewing was another art, perfected by monks. Barley, hops, and herbs were carefully measured to create beer that was nutritious, safe to drink, and often more reliable than water. Brewing was considered part of monastic duty, and ales produced in monasteries became famous across Europe. The tradition of Belgian Trappist beer, still revered today, stems directly from these medieval brewing practices. Meals were deeply ritualized. Monks ate 2 simple meals a day, breaking their fast mid-morning with bread soup or pottage, and gathering again in the evening. Portions were modest, but meals were balanced with vegetables, legumes, and grains, creating diets that were surprisingly nutritious compared to those of peasants. Feasts, when permitted, were celebrations of faith rather than indulgence. On holy days, monks might enjoy baked fish, fruit preserves, or spiced wine, but the atmosphere remained reverent. Monasteries also fed travelers, pilgrims, and the poor, making their kitchens a symbol of charity. In an age when famine was common, these sanctuaries provided not only spiritual guidance, but also sustenance. A weary traveler arriving at a monastery could expect bread ale and a bowl of hearty stew, a simple but life-saving gift. Close your eyes and picture yourself as a visitor in a monastery refectory. You are seated at a long wooden table, a steaming bowl of vegetable pottage before you. Candles flicker against stone walls, and the rhythmic Latin chant of monks echoes softly in the distance. The meal is plain, but every bite feels meaningful, a reflection of centuries-old traditions that wove faith and food into a single act of devotion. Monastic kitchens were more than functional spaces. They were laboratories of sustainability and compassion. These communities preserved ancient agricultural wisdom, elevated humble ingredients into nourishing meals, and reminded medieval Europe that simplicity itself could be sacred. Picture a medieval village in early spring. The snow has melted, but the fields are still bare, and the smell of damp earth clings to the air. Families gather in small smoky cottages, eating meager meals as church bells toll in the distance. This is Lent, a 40-day period of fasting and repentance leading up to Easter, and for medieval peasants, it was a season that tested both faith and endurance. Lent was not just a spiritual exercise, but a complete reshaping of daily life. During these 6 weeks, meat was strictly forbidden, not just from four-legged animals, but often poultry as well. Dairy butter and eggs were banned in many regions, leaving meals stripped of richness. Peasants relied heavily on salted fish grains and vegetables often flavored only with herbs. Even oil was scarce in northern Europe, where olive trees did not grow. So many households turned to almond milk or hemp oil when they could afford it. For most villagers, this meant a monotonous diet of pottage bread and salted herring day after day. Imagine the effort required to observe these rules in a world where physical labor was constant. Men plowed fields, women hauled water, children gathered firewood, all on an empty stomach. The church taught that hunger was a form of purification, a way to share in Christ's suffering. Even wealthy families followed these rules, though their meals might include a greater variety of fish, imported delicacies, or preserved fruits. For the poor, Lent was simply a longer, harsher winter, an extension of scarcity that already shaped their lives. Some regions developed creative ways to cope. In Mediterranean countries, where fish and olive oil were abundant, Lent meals could be flavorful and diverse. In Northern Europe, where salted cod and pickled herring dominated, cooks found ways to add herbs or spices when available. Monks were particularly inventive, crafting elaborate dishes from vegetables, grains, and fish to maintain nutrition while observing strict fasting laws. The days of Ash Wednesday and Good Friday were especially solemn. On these days, many people fasted completely or ate only a small piece of bread and drank water. Picture villagers kneeling in a dimly lit church, ashes smudged on their foreheads, their bellies empty as they prayed for forgiveness and strength. Lent was a deeply communal experience. The entire village shared in this collective sacrifice, reinforcing the bonds of faith and community. Easter, when it finally arrived, felt like a burst of sunlight after months of gray skies. Villagers celebrated with feasts, music, and laughter. Families slaughtered animals, baked honey cakes, and roasted lamb. Tables groaned under the weight of food, and ale flowed freely. The stark contrast between Lent and Easter made these celebrations even more meaningful. After weeks of austerity, abundance felt like a gift from God, a reminder of life's cycles of hardship and joy. The strictness of Lent reflected medieval Europe's deeply religious worldview. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a moral choice, a reflection of obedience to divine law. By giving up rich foods, villagers believed they cleansed their souls and earned spiritual merit. These practices also had practical benefits, though they weren't understood in modern terms. Fasting conserved scarce winter stores, stretched supplies, and aligned agricultural rhythms with the liturgical calendar. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in that medieval cottage during Lent. The fire burns low to save fuel. A pot of thin fish stew simmers quietly. It smells sharp, but comforting. The family gathers around the table, heads bowed in prayer. The food is plain, but there's a sense of reverence, of unity in this shared ritual. Each bite is a reminder of sacrifice, faith, and resilience. Lent was more than a religious season. It was a cultural anchor that shaped the medieval year. Its patterns of austerity and abundance connected villagers to the natural world, their neighbors, and their faith-weaving spirituality into the fabric of daily life. Now, picture the same village that endured weeks of hunger and simplicity during Lent. But this time, the church bells are ringing with joy. The streets are alive with music. Bright banners flutter in the breeze, and the smell of roasted meat drifts from every cottage. It's Easter Sunday, and for medieval villagers, feast days like this weren't just meals. They were moments of spiritual and cultural renewal, a time when the entire community felt lifted out of the grind of daily survival. Feast days punctuated the medieval calendar, offering reprieve from fasting and labor. Major holy days like Christmas, Easter, All Saints' Day, and local saints' festivals turned villages into centers of celebration. Food played a central role symbolizing abundance, blessing, and divine generosity. These days weren't only for nobles or clergy. Even the poorest peasants celebrated pooling resources and sharing meals. Imagine a Christmas feast in a medieval hall. A great fire roars in the hearth, warming a room decorated with evergreen boughs. Tables are laden with roasted goose or pork loaves of fresh bread, honey cakes, and pitchers of ale. Children laugh as they nibble on rare sweets like candied nuts. For peasants, this meal might be the only time of year they tasted meat in abundance, and the memory of it carried them through the lean months that followed. Feast days were not merely indulgence, they were deeply spiritual. The church used food to reflect the rhythm of faith, alternating between austerity and abundance. These meals celebrated God's gifts, reinforcing gratitude for the harvest livestock and the land itself. Many festivals had pagan roots, transformed by Christianity into sacred celebrations. Harvest festivals, for example, often featured bread made from the first grain of the season, blessed by priests, before being shared among villagers. Pilgrimages and saints' days also brought unique flavors to medieval tables. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites shared regional recipes, introducing new dishes and spices. A villager might taste saffron or cinnamon for the first time at a festival, creating excitement and curiosity about distant lands. Food became a cultural bridge, connecting remote villages to the wider medieval world. Imagine yourself walking through a bustling market square during a saint's feast. The air hums with laughter and music from fiddlers and bagpipers. Merchants sell sugared almonds, honeyed pastries, and roasted chestnuts. Children clutch wooden toys, while adults raise mugs of ale, their faces flushed with warmth and joy. After months of simplicity and hunger, the feast is not just about eating, it's about celebrating life, faith, and community. For nobles, feast days were occasions to display wealth and generosity. Lavish banquets featured exotic dishes like roasted peacock gilded pastries and wine imported from southern Europe. These displays reinforced the nobility's power, but also their duty of hospitality. In many cases, nobles opened their halls to peasants offering food and drink as a gesture of goodwill and spiritual merit. Even monasteries observed feast days with reverence and joy. Though monks lived simply, holy days allowed for richer meals, often with cheese, honey, and spiced wine. These traditions reflected the Church's teaching that celebration was as important as a sacrifice, creating a sacred balance in the medieval year. Feast days also strengthened bonds within villages. Communities gathered in open spaces, sharing dances, songs, and food. Couples announced betrothals. Neighbors exchanged gifts, and disputes were often set aside during these celebrations. In a world where survival was a constant struggle, these moments of joy were essential for mental and spiritual health. Close your eyes and picture yourself in the glow of torchlight, sitting at a wooden table covered with roasted meat bread and steaming pottage. Laughter fills the hall, the music of fiddles echoes through the rafters, and the sweet scent of baked apples drifts through the air. For one night, hunger and hardship are forgotten, replaced by warmth, gratitude, and celebration. Feast days and festivals were more than indulgence. They were lifelines of hope. They reminded medieval people that life wasn't only toil and prayer, but also joy, community, and divine generosity. In this rhythm of fasting and feasting, the soul found balance, a cycle of sacrifice and celebration that gave meaning to every season. Close your eyes and imagine kneeling at a wooden table in a dim medieval cottage. A loaf of bread sits in the center, flanked by a bowl of pottage and a jug of ale. The family bows their heads as the father murmurs a prayer, making the sign of the cross over the bread before breaking it. This simple act captures a profound truth of the medieval world. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was moral and spiritual currency. The medieval mind saw food through a lens of faith. Every harvest, every loaf of bread, and every jug of ale was considered a gift from God, and wasting food was a sin. Leftover crumbs were carefully collected. Bones were boiled for broth. Stale bread was soaked in ale or milk to soften it. Even the poorest peasants treated meals with reverence, aware that hunger was never far away. The Church reinforced these values through sermons, laws, and traditions. Villagers were taught that gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins, endangered their souls. Overeating, indulgence, or hoarding food was seen as selfishness, a crime against both God and community. Monks wrote extensively about the virtues of moderation, teaching that a humble diet brought one closer to holiness. Even nobles, despite their banquets, were expected to practice restraint, balancing wealth with charity. Charity and food were inseparable. Medieval Europe's social safety net was woven from religious obligation. Monasteries fed the poor parish churches, distributed bread, and nobles were expected to host meals for pilgrims and beggars. In many towns, almonries provided daily handouts of bread to those in need. A wealthy person's reputation hinged as much on their generosity with food as on their political power. Meals themselves became acts of devotion. Families prayed before eating, and fasting wasn't limited to Lent. Many villagers observed weekly fasts abstaining from meat on Fridays to commemorate Christ's crucifixion. These rituals instilled gratitude and discipline, turning eating into a spiritual practice. Even the design of kitchens reflected faith. Crosses were carved into beams, and bread ovens were often blessed before use. The moral meaning of food extended beyond religious obligation. It shaped relationships between neighbors. Villagers shared meals at weddings, funerals, and harvest feasts. During hard winters, families traded or gifted food to one another, cementing bonds of loyalty. In some communities, bread was even baked with marks indicating the baker, ensuring fairness and accountability. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was a moral glue holding society together. Imagine visiting a medieval monastery kitchen. A monk stirs a pot of vegetable stew, humming softly, while another kneads dough for bread. A servant prepares loaves for distribution to beggars at the gates. This simple scene reflects centuries of tradition, where feeding the hungry was an act of worship as important as prayer. In a world where famine was frequent, this generosity could mean life or death. Even the smallest ingredients carried moral weight. Spices rare and costly symbolized wealth and status, but using them wisely reflected virtue. Honey was prized for its sweetness and healing properties, seen as a symbol of God's goodness. Salt, vital for preserving meat and fish, was considered sacred, often blessed in religious ceremonies. Every bite of food carried layers of meaning, connecting daily life to divine order. This moral framework influenced medieval cooking itself. Meals were designed to nourish the body while uplifting the spirit. Recipes combined practicality with symbolism. Fish symbolizing purity, bread representing Christ's body, and herbs believed to offer protection from evil. Medieval people didn't just eat. They contemplated, prayed, and reflected with every meal. Picture a winter evening in a small cottage. The family gathers near the fire hands, clasped in prayer, before sharing a simple supper of bread and onions. The food is humble, yet it carries profound significance. A reminder of God's providence and the importance of gratitude. In this world, eating was never mundane. It was a moral act, a spiritual experience that tied communities together and gave meaning to survival itself. Step outside a medieval cottage in midsummer. The fields of barley and rye stretch beyond the village, but closer to home lies something smaller, humbler, and no less essential: the peasant garden. Unlike the vast fields owed to the Lord, this patch of land belongs to the family. Here, every plant is chosen carefully, nurtured for survival, and harvested with gratitude. Medieval gardens were practical, not decorative. Villagers grew hardy vegetables that thrived in their region's climate: onions, leeks, garlic, cabbages, parsnips, turnips, peas, and beans. These crops weren't glamorous, but they were nutritious, providing vitamins and calories during lean months. Leeks and onions, staples of every cottage, added flavor to otherwise bland dishes like pottage. Cabbage was boiled, pickled, or fermented, becoming a winter standby. Peas and beans offered protein, making them invaluable in diets where meat was scarce. Picture a mother kneeling in her small garden, hands stained with soil as she pulls carrots from the earth. Chickens scratch nearby, searching for insects. The garden smells of rosemary, thyme, and sage herbs, as essential as vegetables. Herbs weren't just for flavor, they carried medicinal and spiritual significance. Lavender tucked into bedding deterred lice. Mint freshened breath and flavored ale. Rue basil and garlic were believed to ward off evil spirits or illness. These beliefs, though rooted in superstition, reflected a deep connection between daily life and the natural world. Seasonality shaped the peasant diet. Fresh vegetables were abundant in summer and autumn, but scarce in winter, forcing families to preserve food. Pickling, salting, drying, and fermenting turned summer's bounty into winter sustenance. Picture cabbage packed into barrels of brine carrots, buried in sand-filled bins to keep them from rotting, and beans strung up to dry in cottage rafters. Nothing was wasted. Fruit trees and bushes were prized possessions. Apples, pears, cherries, and plums grew in village orchards or hedgerows, offering sweetness in a diet dominated by grains. In autumn, families gathered windfall apples for cider making, turning fruit into a drink that could last all year. Pears were poached in honey, and quinces, too tart to eat raw, were simmered into preserves or used to flavor meat dishes. Strawberries, blackberries, and raspberries grew wild, gathered by children who roamed the forest edges with woven baskets. Foraging was a vital skill, passed down through generations. Families knew which mushrooms were safe to eat, which roots could be used in medicine, and where to find wild nuts. Chestnuts roasted over an open fire were a staple in mountainous regions, while hazelnuts added protein and fat to peasant diets. Honey gathered by local beekeepers or foraged from wild hives sweetened dishes and was valued for its healing properties. In an age without sugar, honey was liquid gold. The peasant garden also held spiritual significance. Many families planted herbs believed to protect the home: rosemary. By the door, garlic hung above windows, and fennel tucked into beams. These customs blended Christian symbolism with older pagan traditions, reflecting the medieval world's fusion of faith and folklore. Gardens weren't just practical, they were protective charms woven into daily life. Imagine sitting outside a cottage on a warm evening. A woman ties bundles of thyme and sage to hang from the rafters, while children chase fireflies through rows of cabbage. The air is thick with the scent of mint and lavender. In a world where famine was always near, this modest garden represents independence, resilience, and hope. These gardens were lifelines. They provided flavor, variety, and nutrition when grain and bread dominated the table. In times of scarcity, a single row of beans or a barrel of pickled cabbage could mean the difference between hunger and survival. While nobles dined on elaborate dishes, peasants relied on the quiet power of these gardens, testaments to ingenuity, tradition, and the unbreakable bond between people and the land. Picture yourself standing in a medieval garden at dawn. Dew glistens on leaves, and the air is thick with the scents of thyme, rosemary, and sage. To a medieval peasant, These plants weren't just ingredients for cooking, they were medicine, protection, and even magic. In an age before pharmacies and modern science, herbs were lifelines, their uses passed down through generations in whispers and folklore. Every village had someone known for their knowledge of herbs, a wise woman, a midwife, or an elder who understood which plants could heal and which could harm. In a smoky cottage, she might dry bundles of lavender to calm fevers, grind garlic into a paste for infections, or steep peppermint leaves to soothe a troubled stomach. These remedies weren't always effective by modern standards, but they reflected centuries of observation and a deep connection with nature. Some herbs carried spiritual significance. Rue was hung above doors to ward off evil spirits. Rosemary was burned at funerals to cleanse the air, and basil was thought to bring luck. Garlic, with its sharp smell, was considered a powerful protector against illness and even supernatural beings. In times of plague, villagers wore small pouches of herbs around their necks, believing the fragrance would block miasmas or bad air thought to cause disease. Monasteries preserved and expanded this herbal knowledge. Monks kept detailed herbals illustrated books, cataloging plants and their uses, and cultivated physic gardens filled with healing plants. Yarrow, valerian comfrey, and chamomile grew in neat rows, tended by robed figures who combined prayer with medicine. These gardens became early centers of medical study, blending Christian faith with practical knowledge inherited from Roman and Arabic texts. Herbs also flavored daily life. Thyme, sage, and parsley were staples in medieval kitchens, masking the taste of salted fish or aging meat. Dill and fennel added brightness to pickles and stews. Even peasants who couldn't afford imported spices like cinnamon or pepper relied on their gardens to create depth and flavor in simple dishes. Cooking and medicine were deeply intertwined. Every meal was also a kind of remedy. Imagine a scene. A mother stands over a simmering pot, sprinkling in rosemary, not just for taste, but to help ward off winter illnesses. She ties bundles of dried lavender to hang in the rafters, filling the cottage with a calming scent believed to repel pests. Children play nearby, chewing on sprigs of mint to freshen their breath. For them, herbs are as ordinary as bread and water, a natural part of survival. Superstition and practicality often overlapped. Mandrake roots, prized for their human-like shape, were believed to have magical properties, though few peasants ever saw one. Elder trees were thought to be sacred. Villagers never cut them down without leaving an offering. These beliefs added layers of meaning to the plants that surrounded medieval life, making every herb a symbol as well as a tool. Herbal remedies also revealed medieval ingenuity. Willow bark tea, for instance, was used to ease pain centuries before the discovery of aspirin. Honey mixed with thyme was applied to wounds, harnessing natural antibacterial properties. Even when cures failed, these practices reflected a desire to understand and control a harsh, unpredictable world. Close your eyes and imagine a medieval cottage filled with herbs, drying from the rafters, their fragrance mingling with the smell of smoke and bread baking in the hearth. Shelves hold clay jars, labeled in Latin, each containing dried leaves, roots, or powders. The hum of bees outside reminds you that honey is not just sweet, it's medicine. In this world, plants weren't background scenery. They were allies in the fight for survival. Herbs bridged the gap between science, faith, and magic. They connected peasants to ancient traditions, monastic scholarship, and the mysteries of nature itself. Whether brewed as tea, burned as incense, or tucked into bedding, these humble plants shaped medieval health and culture, offering hope in a time when hope was often scarce. Picture a medieval summer morning. The sun rises over a small orchard, its golden light filtering through the branches of apple and pear trees, heavy with ripening fruit. Birds chatter in the hedgerows, and the scent of blossoms and earth fills the air. In a world where sugar was rare and precious fruit was nature's sweetness, treasured in every form, whether eaten fresh, dried, or preserved. Fruit trees were prized possessions in villages. Even peasants, who didn't own land, often had rights to gather fruit from common orchards or hedgerows. Apples, pears, plums, and cherries were staples, and their varieties reflected centuries of cultivation. The medieval apple wasn't always the shiny, uniform fruit we know today. It was smaller, sometimes tart, but incredibly versatile. Apples were eaten raw, baked into pies, or pressed into cider, a drink beloved by peasants and nobles alike. Cider making was a seasonal ritual. Imagine men and women gathered in an orchard, loading baskets of apples into wooden presses. Juice flows into barrels, and the air smells of sweetness and fermentation. Cider was more than a drink. It was a safe source of hydration in an age when water was often unsafe. Families stored barrels of cider for the winter months, turning a summer's bounty into sustenance for cold nights. Pears, often too hard to eat raw, were simmered with honey or wine. Quinces, a golden fruit with a strong fragrance, were prized for their ability to flavor meats and sauces. In wealthier households, quinces were boiled into a thick paste, an early form of marmalade, that became a delicacy served on feast days. These fruits symbolized abundance, appearing in religious art and literature as reminders of Eden's beauty and God's generosity. Summer also brought an explosion of wild berries. Children roamed the edges of forests and fields with woven baskets, staining their fingers red with strawberries and raspberries. Blackberries grew in thorny brambles, their harvest a family event that ended with berry pies or honeyed preserves. In autumn, plums and damsons were dried to last through winter, their wrinkled sweetness a rare treat when the snow fell. Nuts, too, played a vital role. Hazelnuts and walnuts were gathered and stored, providing healthy fats and protein. In mountainous regions like the Alps, chestnuts became a dietary staple. Villagers roasted them over open fires, ground them into flour, and used them to bake bread when grain was scarce. The chestnut tree was so essential to survival in some regions that it was called the bread tree. Preservation was an art form. Without sugar, medieval cooks relied on honey vinegar and drying techniques to store fruit. Imagine rows of apple slices drying in the warm sun, jars of cherries preserved in honey, and barrels of fermented plums stored in cool cellars. These techniques weren't just practical, they were acts of hope, preparing for seasons of scarcity. Fruit also carried symbolic meaning. In Christian art, apples often represented temptation, while grapes symbolized Christ's blood in communion wine. Orchards were sacred spaces, featured in poetry and illuminated manuscripts as places of peace and plenty. Monasteries, with their carefully tended orchards, became centers of agricultural innovation, grafting fruit trees and developing new varieties that spread across Europe. Close your eyes and picture a medieval harvest celebration in an orchard. Lanterns hang from tree branches, their warm glow lighting families gathered on blankets, eating fresh apples and pears. Children laugh as they climbed branches to pick the last cherries of the season. In this moment, the hardships of peasant life feel far away. The sweetness of fruit fleeting and seasonal was a reminder of nature's generosity, a burst of joy in a life often defined by scarcity. For medieval villagers, fruit wasn't just food, it was a taste of celebration, health, and connection to the land. Every tree, every berry bush carried centuries of care, tradition, and symbolism. Orchards were living treasures, offering not only sustenance, but beauty and meaning in a harsh, unpredictable world. Picture yourself in a medieval village tavern at dusk. The wooden tables are rough-hewn, the fire crackles in the hearth, and the smell of roasting meat mingles with the yeasty aroma of ale. Farmers and laborers gather after a day's work, mugs in hand, laughter filling the smoky air. In a world where clean water was never guaranteed, ale cider and mead weren't luxuries, they were staples of daily life. Ale was the drink of choice for most peasants, brewed at home or by local alewives. Unlike modern beer, medieval ale was usually unhopped, resulting in a sweeter, cloudier drink. It was rich in calories and nutrients, making it a vital part of the peasant diet. Brewing was a domestic skill. Women often managed household production, boiling barley and malt, then fermenting the mixture in wooden barrels. Each household's ale had its own flavor, reflecting local water sources, grains and herbs used for seasoning. Small ale, with low alcohol content, was served to children and laborers, providing hydration without the risks of unsafe water. This lighter brew was consumed throughout the day, even at breakfast, and was safer than many water sources contaminated by waste or runoff. Drinking ale wasn't considered indulgent. It was essential. A gallon a day was common for adults, fueling them through hours of manual labor. Cider was equally important in regions with abundant apple orchards. Picture a chilly autumn day. Villagers press apples into wooden vats, the juice flowing into barrels stored in cool cellars. Over time, the juice ferments into a crisp, tart drink that sustains families through winter. Cider making was a community event, its techniques passed down for generations. Barrels of cider were prized as trade goods, bringing a taste of sweetness to even the harshest months. Mead, made from honey and water, carried a sense of magic and celebration. Honey was precious, gathered from carefully tended hives or foraged from wild bees, and mead reflected that rarity. It was brewed for weddings, feast days, and religious ceremonies, a drink associated with nobility and myth. Imagine sipping golden mead in a candlelit hall, its sweetness a reminder of summer's warmth during winter's darkest nights. Brewing was both science and art. Monasteries played a central role in refining these traditions, experimenting with fermentation techniques and documenting recipes. By the High Middle Ages, hops began to appear in brewing, especially in Germany, where they improved shelf life and flavor. Yet for centuries, ale and cider remained deeply local, with each village developing its own signature brews. Drinks also reflected class differences. Nobles and clergy enjoyed imported wines, particularly from France and Italy, but these luxuries rarely reached peasants. Instead, villagers perfected their own beverages using what was available. Herbs like yarrow mugwort and rosemary-flavored ales, while cider varied in sweetness depending on apple varieties. Even mead recipes shifted from region to region, incorporating spices or nuts when possible. Imagine walking into a peasant home at midday. A jug of small ale sits on the table next to a loaf of rye bread and a pot of cabbage stew. The drink is cloudy but refreshing, a vital source of calories and comfort. At harvest festivals, that same table might hold mugs of cider or a carefully guarded bottle of mead, opened only for special guests. For medieval people, drink wasn't merely about taste. It was part of the rhythm of life intertwined with seasons, celebrations, and survival. These beverages also connected villages to broader trade networks. Salt for brewing, imported spices for mead, and barrels for storage were all part of an economic web stretching across medieval Europe. Brewing skills gave women economic power as alewives, allowing them to sell surplus ale at markets and fairs. In many towns, these women became key figures in local economies, their expertise shaping both taste and culture. Close your eyes and picture a cool evening in a medieval tavern. The fire flickers on stone walls, and villagers raise their mugs, voices blending in song. Outside, the fields rest in darkness, but in and warmth and camaraderie flow as freely as ale. These simple drinks, crafted from grain fruit and honey, were more than nourishment. They were a symbol of resilience, community, and the ingenuity of people who learned to transform nature's gifts into daily sustenance. Picture a medieval village at dawn. The sky glows pale gold as women in woolen cloaks make their way along muddy paths, wooden buckets balanced on yokes across their shoulders. They're heading for the village, well, a place as essential as it was social. In a time when ale and cider were staples, water remained the foundation of life. Precious, difficult to obtain, and often risky to drink. Clean water was far from guaranteed. Streams and rivers were convenient sources, but they often doubled as laundry stations, livestock watering spots, and waste disposal sites. Picture a slow-moving stream where children play, while just upstream someone washes clothes, and another dumps refuse. Contamination was a constant threat, but medieval villagers didn't fully understand germs. Instead, they blamed foul odors, miasmas for sickness, avoiding bad-smelling water whenever possible. Wells were safer, but labor-intensive. Digging one required skill and strength, often reaching 30 feet or more to access clean underground water. Stone-lined walls and wooden buckets made these wells lasting village landmarks. The sound of a bucket hitting water at the bottom was a comforting signal of security. Families guarded their well rights fiercely. Access to fresh water could mean survival during drought or plague. Imagine a morning scene at the well. Women gather to chat while they fill buckets, exchanging news about births, illnesses, or harvest predictions. Children run around playing as mothers, carefully hoist full buckets and carry them home. These trips were daily rituals, weaving community bonds as tightly as they ensured hydration. Water was used carefully and sparingly. Drinking was often supplemented by small ale or cider, not because medieval people hated water, but because fermentation made these drinks safer in many regions. Where clean mountain springs existed, villagers drank freely, even collecting rainwater in barrels for cooking and washing. Wells were covered with wooden lids to keep animals and debris out, and many were blessed by priests, turning them into spiritual as well as practical resources. Bathing was rare, but water still played a central role in hygiene. Families used it to wash hands, faces, and feet daily, a necessity for people who worked in fields or tended livestock. Bathing tubs, when available, were small and wooden, often shared by an entire family. Rivers and ponds served as natural bathing spots in summer, though this carried risks of parasites and disease. Despite popular myths, medieval people weren't completely indifferent to cleanliness. They simply worked within the limitations of their time. Monasteries and castles had more advanced water systems. Monks designed aqueducts, cisterns, and filtration systems, while castle engineers created sophisticated plumbing with lead pipes and gravity-fed fountains. Knowledge of Roman engineering lingered in some places, influencing medieval designs. For peasants, however, water access remained a daily labor requiring teamwork and endurance. Superstitions surrounded water sources. Springs and wells were often believed to be sacred, tied to saints or ancient pagan spirits. Pilgrims traveled to holy wells, drinking or bathing in their waters for healing. Some villages decorated wells with flowers on feast days, blending Christian and folkloric traditions. Water wasn't just practical, it was mystical, symbolizing life purity and divine blessing. Picture a medieval summer evening. Rain barrels line the side of a cottage, catching fresh rainwater dripping from thatched roofs. A family gathers around a basin, washing hands before supper, while a jug of spring water chills in the shade. In winter, they melt snow over the fire, grateful for every drop. Though ale and cider dominated the table, water remained the hidden hero of survival, connecting communities to the land and the seasons. In a world defined by scarcity, every drop of clean water was precious. Carrying it home was backbreaking work, but it symbolized resilience and care. Wells became social hubs, rain barrels lifesavers, and springs sacred treasures. Medieval people may not have understood microbes, but they understood respect for water's power to nourish, heal, and sustain life itself. As our journey draws to a close, picture yourself back in that humble medieval cottage, sitting near a hearth that glows softly against rough wooden walls. The smell of smoke lingers in the air, mingled with the faint scent of herbs drying overhead. Outside, the fields are quiet, blanketed in mist. You've walked through the rhythms of a medieval year, shared in its scarcity and its abundance, and tasted the resilience of those who lived centuries ago. From the heavy loaves of rye bread and bubbling pots of pottage, to orchards heavy with fruit and barrels of cider fermenting in cool cellars, every detail of this world tells a story. Food was never just fuel, it was survival, faith, and identity. Every bite carried meaning. Bread symbolized life itself. Fasting linked communities in shared devotion, and feast days brought a rare taste of joy. Peasants worked tirelessly to coax food from the land, using every scrap and preserving every harvest. Their ingenuity shaping traditions we still echo today. Yet this was not merely a story of hardship. Medieval villages thrived on community. Gardens brimmed with herbs and hope. Monasteries preserved knowledge, turning simple ingredients into nourishing meals. There was beauty in this simplicity, a quiet dignity in meals eaten by firelight, and a profound connection between people and the land they depended on. As you drift to sleep, imagine the crackle of the hearth and the comforting weight of a woolen blanket. The medieval world was harsh, yes, but it was also deeply human, alive with laughter, prayer, and the smell of freshly baked bread. Across centuries, their humble tables still invite us to pause, reflect, and remember. Food is history, culture, and survival, woven into every grain and drop.